Hey everybody, welcome to Chapter 6, The World of Rome, from 750 BCE to 400 CE. That's a period of approximately 1200 years. We'll be looking at the Roman Empire. It's a good time to say that. I often would call it the Roman Empire. Officially, it's only an empire for the last 500 years or so. Starts out as a monarchy for 250, then a republic for, I don't know, 500 years or so, and then 500 years or so of empire. But often referred to as Roman Empire. Just to understand the different time periods, we refer to it as monarchy, then republic, then empire, even if I just refer to the whole thing as empire sometimes. All right, the Romans in Italy. This is probably the most influential ancient civilization for the Western world, Western civilization. Roman expansion lasts for about 1,200 years, and by its end, Rome rules most of Western Europe, Northern Africa, much of the Middle East. Today, the Roman Empire, at its largest, encompassed an area of approximately 50 countries in the modern world. Its beginnings, though, were pretty modest beginnings. We talked about the Greeks. Oftentimes, the Greeks founded colonies all around the Mediterranean. Well, the Italian peninsula juts out right into the middle of the Mediterranean, and there were lots of Greek colonies along this peninsula. With all this Greek influence, it's no surprise that the Roman culture mirrors the Greek culture in many ways. Weirdly ironic, too, when you consider the Romans didn't have a lot of respect for the Greeks. They thought the Greeks were kind of weak. Interesting. We find many similarities between the cultures, but it really starts off here with the Etruscans. The Etruscans were probably the first permanent settlers in central Italy. They traded with the Greeks. They traded with other groups, the Latiums, other groups along the Italian peninsula. These small settlements, probably Stone Age settlements. The Etruscans probably settled in Italy, the Italian peninsula. Remember, there's no country of Italy. Even I say Italy now and then. No, there's no Italy. It's just that the Italian peninsula that today is known as the country of Italy. These Stone Age settlements probably borrowed a lot of Greek knowledge, a lot of Greek influence. The Romans and the Etruscans as well, really. This is what we consider the beginnings of Rome. We call it the Etruscans because the Etruscans ruled Rome for the first 250 years or so. But we do consider the Etruscan period the Romans. That was the beginnings of the Roman Empire. At this point in time, the Romans were a relatively small group, pretty much controlled, dominated by the more powerful Etruscans. So even though the Romans and the Etruscans and the Greeks and others, they're all different people, all different languages, all different writings, eventually they all sort of meld together into this Roman culture, which takes over the peninsula. The Etruscan Kings ruled for probably 250 years. Over this time, it grew to a small kingdom. It's small. And this culture of Roman, Etruscan, and Greek all pretty much blends together into what becomes Rome, what becomes the entire Roman civilization. There's other cultures too. These are just probably the most significant, these three. From 1000 BCE to 500 CE, we see this Etruscan Greek influence on the Roman populations, and the Etruscans ruled from about 750 to 509. This is a statue here. It's a statue, or as so many things we have today are copies, copies of things. Of an Etruscan king of some sort. And then how do you like this? If you see these horses with wings, these are what are known as, in the Greek culture, I think Pegasus. is what they were, with the winged horses. So we can see how the Etruscans use this type of imagery, which is decidedly Greek, but the Etruscans are using it because this is Etruscan art. So we can see the incredible influence the Greek culture had upon the Romans. And actually, in many ways, it is difficult to differentiate between the two. Frankly, the Romans and the Etruscans just copied a bunch of shit off the Greeks. They really did. This is what makes Rome so successful, really. They're really good at assimilating foreign cultures and adopting them into their culture and making them Roman culture, even though it was not really Roman. This is the Etruscan homeland here. You can see this dark purple area. Here's a city of Rome here, which the Roman people at this time were a minority, a small population. This is the Italian peninsula. Lots of Greek settlements along the peninsula, and each of these are different Etruscan cities. So these were the first lords of the Roman peoples. The Roman conquest of Italy. There are lots of myths about the founding of Rome. The most popular myth probably focuses on Romulus and Remus. That's this bronze statue, I guess you want to call it. We have Romulus and Remus suckling from a she-wolf. And this is it's a myth. There's probably no truth to it at all. These were two brothers. They were descended from a god and Aeneas. Aeneas is significant because Aeneas was a noble who actually fled from Troy after the destruction of Troy back in the 1200s. So, supposedly the fall of Troy, Aeneas, who was a hero, escapes Troy, found some cities or a Greek colony in Italy, the Italian peninsula. Eventually, there's gods involved, and we have what we call demigods, which are people that are half human, half god. And so, supposedly, Romulus and Remus are descended from Aeneas, half human, half god. They've got godly blood in them. Blah 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 blah. It's all bullshit, of course. It is this myth. And what is interesting about the myth is the myth was actually not created until 700 years later than the founding of Rome. So it's a myth created 700 years later to establish how great and powerful Rome has always been. Talk about revisionist history. That's one of the popular myths. They were abandoned in the wild, raised by a she-wolf, and of course Romulus, the reason it's called Rome instead of Reem, I don't know, is because Romulus slew his brother. Interesting little Cain and Abel story there, sort of, long before Jesus and Christianity. But we have the brother slaying brother, and then Romulus founds Rome. There's also a story about a woman who is raped, and then the Romans rise up to overthrow the Etruscans because it's the Etruscan, a son of a king who rapes. There is a story of 7 Etruscan kings who were corrupt and terrible and tyrannical, and the Romans rose up to overthrow the king. There's lots of stories. Lots of stories. The reality is, somewhere around the 500s, the Romans simply got tired of being ruled by the Etruscans. They probably outnumber the Etruscans. They rise up, they overthrow the Etruscans, and the Romans declare independence and establish the Republic in 509. This was the removal of the last king, the establishment of the Senate, and the Senate will then rule Rome, which is a group of elite men, instead of one single royal family. Eventually, their government is ruled by 2 consuls and the Senate. Now, the government is much more complicated than this. It's much bigger, but I'm not going to spend an hour talking about it because there's all kinds of levels of government. There's all kinds of magistracies, if that's the right word, all kinds of different government officials. Rome had the largest government bureaucracy in the world in ancient history, with the exception of China. So huge government bureaucracy. Consuls were typically two. They were elected on a yearly basis, and they were supposed to just be in charge of the city during times of war and emergency. Interesting enough, Rome went to war every single year. It was actually part of their tradition. They would gather their armies together, they would go march, they would take over a territory or subjugate a territory every single season, like clockwork. So the consuls always had a job every year. But the ones who actually were supposed to govern, make the laws, make the rules, really be in charge of Rome was the Senate. That was the idea. And the Senate is primarily early on made up of wealthy landowners. Wealthy, the rich, the elite, generally. By 265, the Romans have pretty much conquered, I'm on number 3 here. By 265, the Romans have pretty much conquered the Italian peninsula. So it takes, it seems like we went through this quick, but we just went through 500 years. Boom, 500 years down. In the course of 500 years, between the Etruscan conquests, the Roman conquests, they had conquered pretty much the entire peninsula, had been conquered. But through a series of wars and alliances, they also had a huge citizen army, and they were a citizen army. Think like our National Guard. During most of the year, they were laborers, farmers, they had regular jobs. And then for several months during each year, they would be gathered together, drop their plows, pick up their swords, and they would go off and fight in Rome's armies of conquest, their colonization and conquest, for a few months, and then they would return home. And they would go back to being farmers. This was a tradition for centuries. This is the way it worked. And they could do this when they were just conquering the peninsula, which was, a few thousand miles across. They could do this when they only had to march a few days or weeks or march a month to fight, and then they would fight and come back. Eventually, though, once Rome expands outside of the Italian peninsula, doing this becomes problematic. But we'll get to that. They built roads, they built bridges, the largest road system in the entire world until modern times. Something like 50,000 miles. That's where we get the term, too, miles. Miles is the Roman word. 50,000 miles of roads. They built bridges. They made citizens of most conquered people. And many people did just voluntarily join Rome, but others didn't, of course. They made them into soldiers, and the army was able to collect taxes, because once they made citizens of the people, they could tax them. As they expanded, they also adopted the religion of peoples they conquered, especially the Greeks. When they conquer the Greeks, which is after this time period, or a little bit after this, they conquer the Greeks, they take their entire pantheon, which is all the gods, almost exactly take the same exact gods. It's no different. They simply take their entire pantheon of gods and rename them. With the gods still having the same roles, the same powers. That's what the Romans did, though. And it's actually one of the things that made them so successful. They were able to so easily adapt and assimilate other cultures. They just accepted the other cultures in. As long as you accept the general Roman tradition and way of life, they would add new gods to their pantheon. They would add new cultures. Yeah, really interesting. Like Jupiter is Zeus, Mars is Ares. Same gods, just same gods. This shows you by about 265 how the Romans had conquered. See, this is just Roman territory, just this small area. These are Roman territory outside. These are all of Rome's allies. These are Latin colonies. Now, their major enemy in this time period is Carthage. This is their major enemy, which we're going to get to the wars with Carthage here in just a minute, the Punic Wars. Rome was founded on 7 different hills, the Capitoline Hill, and you see the different names of the hills. And generally, early on, people were on those hills based upon their status. Where you lived was determined upon your status, what families you came from. It was an interesting society. It was a class society. That's pretty much all were. There were upper class and lower class. but all were citizens, at least in the heart of the empire. All were citizens. This is, though, just to be clear, officially we call this the Republic period. I say empire, but it's the Republic. 250 years of monarchy, this is the Republic, and then we'll get to empire later. All right, distribution of power in the Roman Republic. The idea in the Republic was that the power was shared between the Senate and the people, as opposed to the kings who had ruled for 250 years, the Etruscan Kings, where they held all the power. This is supposed to be power for all. Early Roman social divisions determined the shape of politics and determined the entire shape of society. Truthfully, the Patricians, these were the upper class, typically wealthy landowners, the elite. They were the land-owning aristocracy, to give a good name for it. And the plebeians were the rest of the free citizens, commoners. Now, all citizens, patrician or plebeian, supposedly had a voice in the government, in political affairs. All right. Patricians held most of the upper offices, most of the high offices in government. They held also most of the social, political advantages. They had most of the money, most of the land. Officers were chosen from the patricians, but patricians had all the military leadership, the generals, the consuls. So all the power was really in the hands of the patricians. But the plebeians did have a voice. They were able to participate in politics to a limited degree, which kept the peace for, well, hundreds of years, although there were some tumultuous periods. The Senate was the most important part of the government. It was created to advise the consuls, who were, I guess, technically the leaders. The two consuls that always governed together were technically the leaders. But over time, the real power in Rome was the Senate. And for hundreds of years, for centuries during the Republic, the true power of Rome was the Senate. They're the ones that had the control over the economy, control over money, control over how the entire political system worked, the laws, the taxation, all of that. One important reason for this was the consuls were often not in Rome. Where were the consuls? Remember, the consuls are the war leaders. Okay, I got us off here a little bit. There we go. The consuls were the war leaders. So as Rome went further and further to war, as this image shows here, battle between the Romans and the Gauls would be, modern-day France, Spain, that region of Western Europe. The consuls would go off and fight in war and be gone for months and months at a time. So while the consuls were gone fighting at war, they were the war leaders, the generals. Who was left to rule but the Senate? This is a battle here between Romans and Gauls. The central figure in this image, who is it? So look at it and think about it for a minute. Who is the central figure? Okay. Once you identify who the central figure is, then what position would this person have held? Politically, militarily, in the government, or in the army? I've already told you what that would be. And then what does that say about the political culture? Think about it. You're in charge of the army. You're in charge of the government. I mean, how much more power can there be? Also, further think about the conflict between the central figure here, who holds what positions, as I just asked, and the Senate. Think about the conflict there between someone who's in charge, has the army, has all the power, and the Senate, who are the ones behind the scenes really making all the rules, making the laws, really governing, while the consul's gone for months and months at a time. Think about that. The guy in the middle, he's got his arm raised with a big sweeping gesture. What do you think that means? What does that suggest? He's on a horse, he's got the arm out, the big open gesture. What does that mean? What could he be saying? A big part of Roman culture was virtue. What are the virtues that might be prized by the Romans as evidenced by this image? That's what you have to think. What virtues would be prized by the Romans as evidenced by this image? You have warriors, you have people fighting, you have people playing music, riding horses, carrying weapons. By the way, these are all the Roman soldiers up here. And down here on the bottom, all the ones that are injured, dead, dying, missing appendages, they've got wounds, they're being crushed by the horses. Those are the Gauls. I mean, look at the soldier here. He's standing over the Gaul. He's got a sword in his hand. You know what he's about to do to him. So what is the purpose of that? What's that significance? All the Romans on top, all the Gauls on the bottom, the Romans all pretty much standing proud in their armor and their clothes and their shields and their swords, while the Gauls at the bottom are being crushed by the Romans. Who looks organized? Who looks like they have power and authority? Who looks calm? Look at their faces. Who looks not that way? Now, this is what's known as a frieze. Sometimes a relief. A relief is a type of carving. A frieze usually tells a story of some sort. There's a story being told here, obvious. This was carved on a coffin. A grave, coffin, tomb, something like that. Why? Why was this carved on a coffin or a tomb for a Roman? Furthermore, what's the significance of that Roman, maybe? If you get this particular image about some battle in Gaul carved on your tomb, what's that say about you? What's that say about your status, wealth? What's that say about your position? Who might you be? In reference to this picture, for instance. Or your family. A lot of stuff to think about there. You know, the whole picture tells 1,000 words or something like that. Well, yeah. Really does. All right, now we'll look at social conflict in Rome. So inequality between the two classes, or the two, as they called them, orders. The plebeians and patricians. This leads to the struggle of the orders in the 5th century. To be clear, the struggle of the orders, this is like an official struggle of the orders. They were constantly at odds with each other. Patricians and the plebeians were constantly at odds. The patricians made up like 150 families. Yeah, that's it. So we're talking about a few thousand people that held almost all the political power, all the money, most of the land. It was certainly an issue of like the 1% and the 99%. But the plebeians were still citizens. And under the laws, they still had a voice. And over the years, they wanted a more stronger voice. They wanted to have more say in politics. And so this struggle, while there is a particular one here in the 4th century, 5th century BCE, they were always struggling with each other. The plebeians were always looking for more authority, always looking for more opportunities against the patricians who seemed to have everything. The main complaint was that only the patricians knew the law. They were typically the only ones that were educated and literate. Your typical plebeian was not, your typical plebeian was not educated. Certainly didn't know the law, didn't have time to go to school. They were workers, they were farmers, they were laborers. They had to work from sunup to sundown to provide for their families. They didn't have time to go to school. They didn't have time to pay for expensive tutors. They didn't have time to sit around and discuss law and politics. They had to work. They had to run their shops. They had to milk the cows and plow the fields and build the ships. Now, there were a lot of slaves in Rome, but still, the majority of the population were regular Roman people who had regular jobs, even with a lot of slaves around. Lots and lots of labor had to be done, and most of the labor was done by Roman citizens. Typically, only the patricians could argue in court. The patricians typically only had, I'm still on number one, by the way. Patricians are the ones that had the money, the time, the education. Only ones who could actually be an orator or a lawyer of any sort was a patrician. So they knew the laws, they knew the rules, they knew how to use everything to their advantage. They had a distinct legal advantage. They had political advantage. They owned the land, the money. So the plebeians really wanted the laws written down for everybody, so everybody could see the laws. So everyone knew what they could and couldn't do, what they could get away with, what was right and what was wrong. So according to tradition, the plebeians basically walked out of Rome. They refused to serve in the army. They refused to be soldiers. They refused to build the ships. They refused to farm the fields. They refused to work. In essence, the entire order of the plebeian, which would have been the majority of Roman peoples, just decided to stop. This is probably an exaggeration, but this probably is something that happened over many years, many marches and protests and boycotts and strikes. They didn't use those terms back then, but that's effectively what they were. And they did this probably over years and decades. And eventually, what seemed to be the most significant was refusing to serve in the army. They were, even though they were citizens and they were bound to serve, they refused to go off and march and fight in war. And that was something the patricians couldn't have. If you don't have an army, you don't have Rome. The army is both defender and offense. So you have to protect what you have, and you also have to take more land and property, and more. You have to conquer more populations. Otherwise, Rome would cease to be Rome. It seems to work. We see the patricians offer up several concessions over several hundred years, actually. This is a very long process. They expanded new political rights. They agreed to write all the laws down, codify the laws. In other words, actually just put them down on paper or on stone, as they did at the time. These were known as the 12 tables, the 12 tablets. That's a copy, like a paper copy there of one of them. And it supposedly had all the laws, all the most important laws, written down for everybody to see. They made copies of it. They posted them in public. They put them in public places. So everybody knew the rules, laws that applied to everyone. In 376, we see him write down more laws and put more laws down, Licinian Sextian laws. This gave the plebeians all kinds of rights. It allowed them to serve in the Senate. It actually allowed plebeians to be consuls. So now, for the first time, after almost 400 years of Roman history, which is way longer than the United States has existed, finally, for the first time, commoners could actually be in the Senate and be a consul and have political positions of authority and power, which means they could also start accumulating more wealth, more property, having higher status. 100 years later, we get the Lex Hortensia. If it's italicized, that means it's an official, like the official term in Latin, if you ever see something italicized. So this is the laws of Hortensia, the Hortensian laws, which gave plebeians actually the right, for the first time, to create laws that affected patricians. So now plebeians can write a law that actually affects the patricians. And this is after almost 500 years of Rome. 5 centuries before they finally get laws around to where the common people can actually have some type of control or authority or some way to actually affect the patricians. I mean, if you really think about in the scope of things here, for half a millennia, the patricians had all the power. Even during the time of the Etruscan Kings, patricians ruled. Patricians had authority and power and had land and status. What we do get, though, by the 2nd, 3rd century here, we get what is probably the most fair and the most equitable system of laws of any ancient society. anywhere in the world. In this time period, there were probably no laws in any place in the world that reach to the extent of actually fair and equitable. This is still not a democracy. This is still we call it a republic, but it's still sort of an oligarchy ruled by a very large base of wealthy people, not a few dozen or hundreds, but maybe even a few thousand. There aren't that many people in the Senate. But if you actually look at the whole structure of government, there's thousands of people in the government. It's still difficult to get in the government. It still requires many, many years. But it is more fair, more equitable than any place in the world, probably. One of the reasons many of our laws in America are based on this. Many of our laws are based on Roman laws. But it's a struggle that lasts centuries just to get what we would refer to as equality. Now, bear in mind, this is also equality now. Full equality, but is it really? Of course it isn't. Because who's left out? Women. Women have no rights. Women have very limited. Don't get me wrong. Women have rights. Women do have some political rights. But they can't vote. They can't serve in the Senate. They can't have any political position, no official position. So women cannot be in politics. You don't have female lawyers. You have only a handful of educated women. And they can't be in the Senate. They can't be consuls. So the equality and the rights that a woman has is really only by extension of her husband or father. But that being said, in Rome, women probably had more equality and rights than in most other ancient civilizations in this time period. Because this idea of equality for citizens applied to female citizens as well. They simply couldn't serve in the government. And of course, there's still slaves and many foreigners. Many foreign peoples didn't have any real rights because they weren't officially Roman. Overseas conquest, the Punic Wars, 264 to 133. Carthage. Carthage was probably the enemy that Rome had to deal with for centuries more than anyone else. They just had to keep coming back to Carthage. Most other enemies, Rome simply attacked them and conquered them, absorbed them into the empire, and then moved on. Carthage was not that simple. By 264, Rome pretty much controlled Italy. It began to expand further into Europe and start to expand into the islands surrounding Italy. There's several islands around Italy, like Sicily, for instance, Corsica, I think. And immediately they came into contact with Carthage. Carthage was an older empire. Carthage had controlled most of the Mediterranean, even before the Romans ever came around. The Carthaginians were probably descended from the Phoenicians, which go all the way back to past the year 1000, so way, way before this. So the Phoenicians were probably the first empire to sort of conquer much of the Mediterranean. Carthaginians were their successors, probably. And once Rome starts to expand off the Italian peninsula, they start running into Carthage. Carthage is everywhere else. Carthage is in Western Europe. Carthage has allied itself with the Greeks. Carthage controls northern Africa. Carthage controls western Asia, the Middle East, much of it. Carthage was a large power. In truth, had Carthage really brought the hammer down on Rome early, they would have probably defeated them. But Carthage didn't do that. Carthage was mostly a merchant trading empire, incredibly wealthy probably. But they were more peaceful than the Romans, and the Romans were incredibly warlike. Again, it was tradition in Rome every single year. You put down your plow, picked up your sword, and went out and went to war, like clockwork. That was the Roman life. You were a citizen soldier if you were a Roman farmer. That was the way it was. Carthage didn't seem to operate that way. And when they ran into the Romans, they fought back against them. And they probably assumed that they would come to some type of an easy peace, some type of alliance. The problem is, the way Rome worked in their mind, every enemy had to be defeated. No matter how many times they had to fight them. No matter how many years they had to come back. If we lost this time, next year we'll come back again and do it again. If we lose next year, we'll come back the next year. And literally, the Romans would just keep coming back. year after year after year after year after year, literally for decades and decades and decades, until finally they defeated their enemies. It did not matter how many lives they had to throw away. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. They would just come back next year. They would keep coming back. It was too much for Carthage to handle. So Carthage is centered in Carthage. The actual city of Carthage is in northern Africa. It's centered in northern Africa. This had become this Mediterranean trading empire. It was bigger than Rome. It was more powerful than Rome, had more money than Rome, but it was not as militaristic as Rome. And therefore, Roman militaristic tendencies eventually overwhelmed Carthage. It takes 130 years to do it, but eventually they beat them into submission and eventually utterly destroy them. These were known as the Punic Wars. The constant wars that they have with the Carthaginians. The first one starts around 264, lasts to 241. Eventually, Carthage is defeated, signs a treaty, surrenders, gives up some land, some islands, gives up some territory. That appeases the Romans for a few years. Carthage is assuming, the Romans aren't just going to keep growing big. I mean, no empire ever approaches the size of what the Romans become. So the Carthaginians could probably never imagine that the Roman Empire was just going to keep coming at them. And not just from across the water. Then they start coming through Europe. Then they start coming through Asia, through Africa, literally every direction. So that ended up in this peace treaty. Then there's a second attempt where the Romans get into conflict with the Carthaginians. They want to expand into Europe. The Carthaginians control what we think of as Spain today. A lot of that was under the control of the Carthage. Many more islands in the Mediterranean. The Middle East, Greece, was an issue here too, because Greece was an ally of the Carthaginians. Rome wants to conquer Greece. They want to conquer and take over Greece. So this is another war between Carthage. Hannibal, who is a Carthaginian general, he leads a massive elephant army across northern Africa, into Spain, across into what we think of as France today, all the way down into Italy. It's a massive undertaking, leads an entire army, something like 50,000 soldiers, war elephants. He attacks Rome successfully. Well, let's say it differently. He attacks Rome and gets into the Italian peninsula, and he rampages across the Italian peninsula for like 10 years. Just roaming across the Italian peninsula, destroying towns and villages and looting and destruction. He never gets the city, though, because Rome pulls its armies into the city and protects the city. Hannibal never goes after the city, realizing that he'd probably lose if he went after the city, because Rome had tens of thousands of soldiers in the city, huge walls. He never does that. The Romans put all their soldiers together under the authority of Scipio Africanus, probably given that title because of what he does. And this general, who was probably a consul, takes an army and sails across the Mediterranean to Carthage in Africa and defeats Carthage, actually goes after the city. He doesn't quite get to Carthage, but he gets so close to Carthage that they recall Hannibal. Hannibal has to come running back, trying to get back and protect Carthage, sort of the heart of the Carthaginian Empire. So even though Hannibal rampaged across Italy for a decade, doing untold amount of damage, I think some historians have suggested as much as 500,000 people died between Romans and Carthaginians, probably mostly Romans. Rome didn't surrender. Massive death tolls. Rome didn't surrender. If anything, what Rome actually did was build up its armies and keep going after. So while the armies are attacking Rome, Rome is actually sending armies down to attack Carthage. It was a good strategy. It worked. Hannibal loses, Scipio wins. And Carthage, once again, has to admit defeat, sign a treaty. Rome gets control of Spain and more islands, more lands. Carthage is in defeat again. and Rome became the winner again. This is the victory that actually sealed their victory. This is actually northern Africa, right close to Carthage. This is the where Carthage basically said, okay, we give. We're done. We're surrendering. Because they feared Scipio Africanus might keep going and eventually destroy Carthage. So they surrendered, gave over Spain, etc. Then, to get total control of the Mediterranean, because the Carthaginians were still around, they wage another war. You see, each one gets shorter. The first one is 24 years. This one is 17 years. This one's only 3 years. They keep shrinking it because by the 100s, Rome is really big. Rome now controls parts of Europe, the Middle East. They've conquered Greece. They control places in Africa. By this point in time, Rome is now much bigger than Carthage. As opposed to when the war started, Carthage was probably bigger. And Carthage collapsed pretty quickly. The city is destroyed. The entire capital city of Carthage is burned to the ground. And when it's over, Rome controls everything. They control Italy, the southern part of Europe here. They take over Spain. They control northern Africa. They've conquered Greece. All of this happens. This right here is in 264 before it starts. As you can see, Carthage, much bigger than Rome, which is just the green area. 130 years later, almost everything you see on this map right now, I don't know what the next map shows, but almost everything you see here is Rome in the course of a little over 100 years. Right there, 133, so green. So yeah, everything that is green is Roman. Parts of northern Africa, Carthage, Spain, parts of southern Europe, all Italy, Greece, all the way to Anatolia, Western Asia. All of this is now Roman by the time they defeat Carthage. And they finally burn Carthage down here. You see the city down there. Interesting. Yep. And you can see this shows the real extent of the Roman Empire up to 200 CE, which, pretty big. The largest empire until modern times. Well, I don't know if you want to consider the Mongols modern. A lot more modern than this. Mongols were, 700 years ago? So, at least until the Mongolian empires. Nothing ever came close to the size of this. It's a little deceptive, though, because what is half of this empire? The Mediterranean Sea. So half of the empire is just water. No one lives there. Although it should be noted the Mediterranean was an integral part of the empire. The Mediterranean had hundreds, thousands of ships, shipping lanes. Of course, there's hundreds of islands. So even though you see mostly empty water, the Mediterranean was incredibly significant. It was crisscrossed by hundreds of shipping lanes, thousands of ships, and that trade going back and across between the three continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia, all connected here. The trade going back and forth, crisscrossing the Roman Empire using the Mediterranean was, of course, an integral part of their entire economy. Take the Mediterranean out of it, and the Roman Empire would be in a much different place. New influences and old values in Roman culture. So with the conquest of the Mediterranean and the conquest of the Greeks, we see a new wealthy and cosmopolitan elite population sort of develop to enjoy all these new luxuries. Roman cities began to include all of the modern pleasures of life, this time period. Public baths, theaters, lots of places of amusement, entertainment, exercise, gymnasia. This is an image here of a bath in England, I think. That is, it's not something you would use today, but it still exists there as a historical site. Roman leisure was heavily influenced by the old Hellenistic culture, the old Greek Hellenistic culture, as the Romans pretty much adopted everything that was Greek. Anything and everything that was Greek, which they considered simultaneously to be a very interesting culture, a very ancient culture, Lots of history, lots of prestige associated with it. And also, again, simultaneously, they consider the Greeks to be weak. The Roman version would, of course, be the improved, the upgraded version of the Greek culture. Greek literature was popular. Most educated Romans spoke both Latin and Greek, Latin being the language of Rome. So they spoke both languages if you were typically a literate, educated person. These Roman bathhouses often became the center of social, the social center, if you will, especially for the upper classes. The places where you'd be seen, you'd go to see and be seen. Libraries and gyms also. This was also one of the few places women could actually go out in public and be in public without men, would be the baths. And the baths were separated, men in one part, women in the other. They were not places for like orgies. But yes, everybody was naked. Nudity, though, was not a... Most ancient cultures weren't prudes like we are today, really. Most ancient cultures had no issue with nudity of their human body. Being naked or topless, men or women, didn't really make a difference. Yeah. So just walking into a public space with hundreds of other people and just dropping your clothes and either exercising. They often exercised in the nude. Imagine that next time you're at the gym. Next time you're at the gym, look around at the 100 people around you and imagine everybody's naked. Now, don't get me wrong, you got lots of good bodies in the gym, but I'm just saying, everybody naked. Yeah, that was they often exercised in the nude. They went to the baths at the nude, the pools. While we do have nude beaches, most beaches are not. Just think about that next time you go to the beach. Everybody naked. It's just so alien to our modern culture. Unless you're French. But other than that, whole alien to our modern culture, and yet that was commonplace back then. There just was nothing to be ashamed of the human body. Sex, reproduction, all that was just nothing unusual about it. Roman social organization was really based on the traditional family structure. The oldest male was in charge of the family with pretty much absolute authority. This is known as the paterfamilias. Actually, this should be italicized. Known as the father of the family. He held authority over everything, including extended family, slaves, everybody and anyone associated with the family, he had total authority over. While women did not have equality in Rome, they could own land, they could inherit property, they could run their own businesses. Generally speaking, women had more authority and equality, even though it isn't like full equality of a man, more so than just about any ancient culture. If you were a female Roman citizen, you were given respect and you had status, and you could take a very active role in society, with some limits. Slavery wasn't based on race. Matter of fact, for all of human history, slavery really has nothing to do with race until modern times. Slavery was usually for debt. You couldn't pay your bills. Today, you get a bad FICO score. Back then, you go and do slavery. So slavery had nothing to do with race or gender. Prisoners of war would often become slaves. That was also a common way to end up in slavery. If you were an enemy and you refused to submit to Rome, some other city or some other city-state, they might enslave your entire population. They might conquer a small region of a couple dozen towns or cities and enslave everybody. Because the Romans came knocking and asked you to surrender and join the Roman Empire, and you said no, well, that was not a good thing. Rome had many, many, many construction projects, many of them built by slaves. The late Republic and the rise of Augustus. This is where we see the fall of the Republic and the beginnings of the Roman Empire around this time period. So by the 2nd century BCE, we're still in the BCE period, Rome was undergoing lots of changes to where we start developing these client armies. What does that mean? Roman armies are not loyal to Rome, but they become loyal to generals. Here we have 3 generals right here I'm going to talk about. And the armies are subject and loyal to the generals because the generals bribe them. In addition to their regular pay, they give them spoils of war, they give them loot, they give them women, they give them land, to basically make the soldiers, and see, sometimes these are huge armies, 50,000 soldiers, all loyal to one single guy. Not loyal to Rome, but loyal to a general, a consul. This rise of the client army leads to lots of conflicts because now we have instead of 2 politicians that don't get along, 2 politicians that are fighting and arguing with each other. Imagine if each of those politicians has 50,000 soldiers that'll do whatever they say. It's obvious. Instead of 2 politicians arguing and bickering and fighting amongst each other, they now have 50,000 men, armed, willing to do whatever they want. And we start seeing these clashes, these client armies. Not for the good of Rome, but for each individual man's desire and hunger for power and status and glory, wealth. Now, over a 100-year period, this brings down the Republic. This destroys the Roman Republic and creates a Roman Empire. Very often the men would go off to war and come back and all their land would be gone. Because now war isn't seasonal. Once we get closer to this late BCE period, this 1st and 2nd century, war is permanent. Men go to war and they're gone for years. They come back home, their entire farm's gone. Their family is, who knows where their family is. They lost everything. They go off and serve their country for years and come back and everything's gone. Many of them are angered about this. The client generals, these patron generals for their client armies, they promise them everything. They'll take care of them. And so we started seeing this greater and greater conflict between these patron generals, these client armies. They would come home and they would give money to the poor. They would give land to the poor. They'd give food to the poor. They would try to sway entire sectors of the Roman population, which by this point in time is in the tens of millions. Maybe 50 million people by now. And so they would come back and try to sway entire swaths of population, hundreds of thousands, millions, by giving them treasure that they went off and conquered and took from some other kingdom. And they would give them food and bread, and yeah, it was just massive conflict that led problems over and over and over, which eventually leads to rebellion, civil war, and the end of the Republic. That's pretty much everything I talked about there. This leads to all this conflict, and eventually the formation of alliances between powerful generals against other generals. And so we have 3 powerful generals here: Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. They gather together their armies and agree to work together to conquer and take over Rome. They believe, well, they argue at least, to their followers that they know what's best for Rome and that they will fix the problems of the Senate. They blame everything on the Senate. They say all the chaos and violence and anarchy that's in Rome, it's all because the Senate are poor rulers. The Senate doesn't know what they're doing. The Senate is full of a bunch of fat, wealthy landowners with slaves that don't really know what they're doing. These generals come back with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They go off and conquer some region and come back. Crassus went east, Pompey went south, Caesar went into Europe, and they come back and they conquer lands, bring back massive treasure and wealth. They give it out to the people and say, "We are your true leaders. We're the true men of Rome. We've gone out and conquered for the glory of Rome and brought back all this treasure and wealth. Here it is. Follow us. Don't follow the Senate. Don't trust the Senate. Those fat politicians that stole your land, don't trust them. Trust us." And to reinforce that, we're going to march our tens of thousands of soldiers through the city of Rome and other cities and other territories, just to show you, hey, we're the ones in charge, you should trust us. And if you don't, well, we've got a sword, point for you if we have to. They form this alliance, this first triumvirate, around 59. It lasts for about 6 years. Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. Let's see. Crassus, I think, dies in war during this time period. He actually goes off on a campaign and gets killed. Pompey married Caesar's daughter and Julia, I think, and then Caesar's daughter died. I don't have this in my notes, but I'm going from memory here. Caesar's daughter then died in childbirth, which therefore, with Crassus dying and Pompey wanting to take land and Caesar wanting to take land, both wanting to be the sole ruler of Rome, now that Crassus is gone, and with Julia dead, there was no reason for Caesar and Pompey to be friends anymore, and they go after each other. And eventually, Pompey's defeated in battle. He flees, if I remember this right, he actually flees to Egypt. And Egypt is so afraid. Egypt is still technically independent at this point. Egypt is still an independent empire, I guess, if you want to call it that. It's much smaller than it used to be. The Egyptians actually kill Pompey. They assassinate him because they're afraid Caesar's going to come down and try to conquer them or attack them for retaliation, as though Egypt is harboring Pompey and protecting him, for instance. So Crassus dies, Caesar and Pompey fall out, Julia dies, Pompey flees to Egypt, he's killed by the Egyptians, leaving just one man standing, Caesar. He claims dominion over the Republic. He says the Republic still stands, but he is the great leader of the Republic. He's going to protect the Republic. Most people understand what happened to Caesar. The senators actually get together and stab him to death on the floor of the Senate. Right there. It would be like a politician stabbing someone to death right on the floor of Congress today. I mean, they just all got together and stabbed him to death. Around 44 BC on March 15th of 44. We call the Ides of March. Kill him. They believed he was a dictator, a conqueror, an emperor. He was. He even took those titles. He argued he was protecting and saving the Republic. But anyway. Well, Rome breaks into another decade of civil war and violence and chaos, more generals with their client armies, etc. We have 3 new generals. Again, there's lots of generals, but we have 3 that rise to the top again. Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. Antony had been a friend and associate of Caesar. I think he'd even been one of his generals, maybe. Lepidus, I don't know much about. Octavian was actually the nephew of Caesar, adopted nephew of Caesar. So Octavian, of course, believed he had the highest status because he was actually related to Caesar. Antony believed he had high status. He had been one of Caesar's generals, I believe, or a competing general. So they formed the second triumvirate, again, to save the Republic from itself, to protect the Republic from those terrible senators. I mean, look what the senators did. They're evil, right? They stabbed Caesar to death, believing Caesar was terrible and evil and was going to destroy Rome. They go after Caesar's killers. They assassinate. They even go so far as to create kill lists. They actually create public lists that they post around Rome, lists of people that can be publicly killed, who are considered enemies of the state. Anyway, they create these kill lists where anyone can attack and kill these people, some of them as senators, wealthy families, etc. And we see power struggles here last for several years. Eventually, Octavian goes after Mark Antony. I don't know what happens to Lepidus. I think Lepidus just retires, I think, and leaves and gives up or something and walks away. That leaves Antony and Octavian to go at it. Octavian chases Antony down, chases him, has multiple battles, eventually chases him all the way to Egypt, where Antony forms an alliance with the Egyptians, with the last pharaoh of the Egyptians, Cleopatra, female pharaoh. the last pharaoh of the great Egyptian civilization, 3,000-year civilization. Antony forms an alliance with Cleopatra. Octavian goes after him. Antony and Cleopatra, realizing Octavian is closing in and is going to kill them, probably execute them, probably torture them, make big public spectacles of them, they commit suicide. They commit suicide together, Antony and Cleopatra, knowing that it's probably far worse what Octavian's going to do to them when he catches them. This all happens around 33, the Battle of Actium. I don't have it on here, but you'll see it on the map in a minute. Octavian, again, becomes the sole ruler of Rome, just as his uncle had done. He takes the title of Augustus. This is the title. His name is Octavian, but he takes the title of Augustus, which means the revered one, in 27 BCE. And that is the official fall of the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic, pardon me. Some will date it to Julius Caesar. We actually, you can see, I've seen 3 different dates. Some will date it to Caesar, who took charge around 48 BCE. Some will date it to Octavian, who conquered and defeated Antony in 31. And also some will date it to 27. Because even after defeating Antony, Octavian still had to defeat other generals, and it wasn't until around 27 when he eliminates all competition, to where there is only one person with power, and only one person with armies left in Rome, and that is Octavian. So, yeah. It is no longer a republic ruled by the Senate. Henceforth, Rome will be ruled by one man, or sometimes 2 or even 4. But the point is, it's ruled by emperors from now on, going forward, and it is now an empire. He takes most of the power away from the Senate. The Senate still stands. He doesn't eliminate the Senate, but he takes all the power from the Senate, gives himself all the titles, calls himself everything. That is a statue of Augustus. Augustus, is that the one, Augustus Invictus? I don't know, what it's called, but it's a statue of Augustus. And this is a little god here. What's the name of that one? Cupid, I think. This was to indicate his status. Cupid is actually the brother of another god, a female god, and ultimately what it was supposed to say was that Augustus was descended from the gods in some way or another, or blessed by the gods. To even had a god here actually hanging off of him. He takes most of the power away from the Senate. As he says, gives him to the self. He reforms into an empire. He takes all the major offices, gives himself all the titles. Imperator, consul, tribune, pontifex maximus, princeps. By the way, there were about 13 titles he gave himself. Pretty much every title of authority and power over today we would use the terms executive, judicial, and legislative branch. He takes all the titles over the Senate, the judicial, all the titles over the executive, which is him, imperator, consul, tribune. He takes the titles over he becomes the high judge, commander of the army, is imperator, chief priest is pontifex maximus, the chief executive is consul, the chief judge is the tribune, the first citizen is the princeps, and more. Again, 13 different titles. Now, the Senate gives him these titles. Why did the Senate just give him these titles? It gives the appearance as though the Senate is basically checkmarking everything he does and saying, basically stamping, it's good. We're with you, Octavian Augustus. We're whatever you want, we're there. The reality is simple. If they didn't do what Octavian said, he would have had them killed. So choice between dying, your family destroyed, your kids, wife, children killed, your estate burned to the ground, and your entire name and family name wiped away from existence, which is what Romans did to disgraced people. They would literally wipe them out of existence. They would even go, and if there were like statues of someone, they would chisel their face off, smooth, and then chisel someone else's face on there. Rome did this. They were incredibly revisionist in how they did their history. They would wipe away history of people that were bad or considered disgraceful. literally wiping them away as though they never existed. So that was your option. Either that would happen to you and your family, or you do whatever the hell Augustus wants. And so the Senate did whatever the hell Augustus wanted. They gave him everything, knowing the alternative was, of course, disastrous. They even go so far as to hire a poet, Virgil, to write a poem known as the Aeneid, which is one of the most famous poems in Roman history. It rewrites Roman history, making Augustus descended from the gods, making Augustus descended from Aeneas. Remember I talked about that legend of Romulus and Remus and the gods and the suckling from the she-wolf? All that is because of Augustus. He had that history written as though it was real, as though it was the real history of Rome. And guess who's descended from Romulus? The founder of Rome, who's descended from a god and a hero of Troy, Augustus. How convenient. It's to legitimize his power. In other words, he's always had power. His family line has always been powerful. He was destined for all of history to rule Rome. Therefore, do whatever the hell he says, whenever he says jump, you jump. He was equating himself with gods. He really was. He even put on coins. His face on one side, and on the other side, the goddess of victory, the victory goddess. I forget what her name is. And so him on one side and goddess on the other, indicating he was the mortal version of the goddess of victory, of the god of victory. He did everything but proclaim himself a god. But without actually saying it, he very much implied to all people that he was, in essence, a god incarnate in mortal form. Even though he was just a poor orphan when Caesar adopted him, a nobody. And he rose to be, well, he created the Roman Empire. Pretty crazy. Talk about a rags to riches story. Wow. Augustus pushes for expansion, Roman expansion, into Europe especially. And Rome does expand and grow. We see expanding further into Europe. And under Augustus, Rome expands further than it had ever expanded before. He believes it's the destiny of Rome to rule the world. And he pushes that. And he actually rules for a very long time. He rules for something like 40 years. And in truth, he does bring about a golden age. As ironic as it might be, his autocratic dictatorship, which is really what it is, brings Rome out of a century of war, internal war. Don't get me wrong, war was always the way, but if war is against other people, that's okay. That's the Roman way, as long as you're fighting other people. Internal conflict is problematic. Pardon me. So he brings Rome out of 100 years of internal conflict and expands, grows the treasury, expands, builds all kinds of projects. Really does make Rome much more powerful and more stable, at least for a while. This gives you Julius Caesar expanded these yellow areas under the period of Julius Caesar as emperor. Augustus then ruled for, almost 40-some years? I believe this is wrong. I think this is a typo on the map. I believe Augustus ruled to 14 CE. Yeah, because he took over power in the 30s BCE, and then he ruled until 14 CE, I think. He ruled for like 40 years. So I believe it's the typo. I think this is supposed to be death of Augustus is 14 CE, I think. He added all these orange areas. Egypt, of course, Egypt. He had to conquer Egypt, Antony Cleopatra. It just keeps expanding and growing. 100 years later, All of these areas, England is now conquered. Parts of northern Africa conquered. The Sinai Peninsula, more into Central Europe. All that conquered by Hadrian, or up to the time of Hadrian. This is Arapacis. This is the altar of peace. This was created during Augustus's life. It was dedicated to Peace, who's in the middle, who's the Roman goddess of peace. Pax is her name. P-A-X. She's a Roman goddess of peace. What is peace in this? What is it in this image that indicates peace? Well, what is missing? There's some things that are notable that are missing. If you want to think about a period of peace, a time period with no war, well, what's missing? What is in this that indicates goodness or success, prosperity, peacefulness, happiness? Lots of things in this. These are also gods or nymphs on the side here. These are like goddesses or like half goddesses, like demigods or like water spirits. I don't, whatever you want to call them. Lots of different ways you can look at it. This is like look at this here. I love this image here. This is almost a serpent or a dragon image. That shows you some influence of what culture. Where did they get that imagery from? Because Rome was on the western end of the Silk Roads. So of course, where was the other end of the Silk Roads? So you can actually see elements in here of Near Eastern cultures, not just Roman culture. But that's what Rome did. Rome incorporated every culture it came into contact. They brought it into Rome, assimilated it, and it became Roman. Everything that Rome accepted into Rome became Roman. It was all Roman. So you have images here. You have babies and animals and all kinds of things. You have plants, vegetation. What is necessary to maintain peace? What do you think the Romans thought was important to maintain peace? Think about the imagery. Think about the gods, the goddesses. What do you have to do during a time of peace? What is really important? What's significant of the babies and all the animals and all the fruits and vegetables you see, the plants? Lots of interesting ideas in this. Lots of significance in this. It's really pretty, too. It looks like it's probably... I don't think I have it in my notes, but what could it be? It could be copper, maybe? It could be a copper panel of some sort. It's nice artwork. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Political and military changes in the empire. Some of the emperors that followed Augustus maintained a stable bureaucracy, while others were ruthless and unbalanced, and even their rule sometimes led to military rebellions. But this period of the 1st and 2nd century CE, overall, this is the time of peace and prosperity in the empire, as the emperor was usually passed down from father to son. Not always, but usually. It was passed down, it was inherited from father to son. So as Rome reached its greatest size, the military became a force for protection. It really became a defensive force, not necessarily a force of war. Rome had borders that stretched for thousands and thousands of miles they had to protect. Military settlements and fortifications were established all across Europe and the Middle East to maintain military security. And of course, they had this massive road system which stretched for tens of thousands of miles. The roads allowed for easy transport of goods, trade, also allowed for quick movement of military troops and soldiers. They had a postal service, so they had a mail service. Generally, in this time period, if you were on roads in Rome, you were safe, you were protected by the extensive bureaucracy and military authority of the Roman Empire. Life in Rome. The city of Rome might have reached as many as 1 million, or 750,000 people. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of slaves, citizens, foreigners. Most people that lived in the city, they enjoyed it was a dual-class society. Most folks were either a privileged elite or you were a commoner, a relatively poorer commoner. Commoners in the cities mostly had crafts jobs, laborers. Rome built, of course, the largest construction projects in the history of man until modern times, using millions of tons of marble and stone and brick and rock and just incredible construction projects that really haven't really rivaled until modern times. The city was full of these projects, including all the surrounding areas. Palaces, elaborate buildings, an elaborate sewage system, aqueducts, running water. Nothing, put it this way, most of the stuff we see in Rome, we won't see in Europe again for 1,500 years. If you're looking at the 1st and 2nd century, we won't see most of these sewage systems or running water systems and all of this for well over 1,000 years, in Europe at least. And truthfully, most of the world. But it's ironic in Europe where they had all this, they lost it all for a very long period of time. These aqueducts are the water canals that served, they brought all the water to town. Rome was full of water fountains and baths, and most of these big projects employed hundreds or thousands of workers, even tens of thousands of workers, building some of the massive projects like the Coliseum, for instance. Incredible stuff. As Rome grew and became bigger and bigger, there were masses of poor in the tens of, and eventually hundreds of thousands of poor, lots of unemployed as well, large numbers of people living in poverty, and large numbers of foreigners. This was the most cosmopolitan international city in the world. People from all continents, all known continents, crisscrossed the Roman Empire. There was the saying, I don't know who it comes from, that all roads lead to Rome. Well, Roman emperors had to find ways to keep all those people pacified, to keep them happy, to keep them content, at least to some degree. Because there were always fears of slave uprisings, and Rome did have slave uprisings. There were always fears of general populace uprisings, and they had that too. Parts of the city were burned down. Chunks of the Rome were burned down in different riots and uprisings over a dozen times. Remember, this is well over 1,000-year period. So there was a constant issue. They had to constantly worry and deal with and debate ways to deal with the masses of poor, impoverished, unhappy people. One of the ways they did this, one of the most effective ways, was simply bread and circuses. It's a generic term referring to keep the people fed so they're not starving, because a starving man will do anything. A starving person, starving people will eat rocks, they'll eat grass, they'll eat dirt. Which also means if they're willing to do that, they're also willing to fight and die and kill for food if they're that desperate. So keep people from starving, giving them bread, giving them grain, and keep them entertained. The circuses is, again, a sort of a general term, entertained with Coliseums, gladiator fights, circuses, entertainment, whatever, exotic animals. This is one of the reasons the Coliseum was built. The Coliseum, which is one of the things so many people know about Rome, was literally only in use for 100 years or so, 150 years. So a very short period of time, Coliseum was in use. Massive project, still stands today. A lot of it still stands today. To entertain them, the gladiator games. They had to do something with tens of and hundreds of thousands of poor and common impoverished people, a lot of them starving. What about outside Rome? Outside the heart of the empire is known as the provinces. How did Rome deal with the provinces? So the provinces were very prosperous during this time period. Most of the land was used for farms. Most of the provinces were simply farmland to feed a population which by this time period was probably approaching 100 million people in the empire. Largest in the world. At least as big as, I think it's the Han Dynasty. I think it's the Han Dynasty in China, which also was around the same population. So these territories included places like Britain, Gaul, which is modern-day France, Germania, Germany, Syria in the Middle East, Greece, Anatolia in Asia. And these regions were often settled by Roman citizens, their soldiers, their families. And what this does creates these Roman colonies, these Roman towns, in many cases hundreds, thousands of miles away from Rome itself, these regions. And Rome often forcibly recolonized people there. They would recolonize entire communities. But because they would send Roman soldiers to these places as well, and these Roman units would sometimes be 50,000 strong to go out and guard a province, all of those men are going to look for women. They're going to have wives. They're going to have families. They're going to have kids. And if you have 50,000 soldiers there, many of them young men that don't have families back in Rome, therefore they're just going to stay there. They're going to settle down. They're going to look for a local woman. And in just a course of a couple of decades, you have dozens of thriving Roman cities and towns that look Roman, they sound Roman, they worship Roman gods, they speak Roman languages, Latin or Greek, and we see the Roman culture being expanded in places thousands of miles from the capital, across Afro-Eurasia, simply by virtue of having the Roman soldiers there. Now, some Roman soldiers wanted to go home. Some had families, especially the more veterans. Especially the upper ranks might have had families back in Rome, in Italy. But the younger soldiers, which would have been the majority of the army, at least half the army, would have been younger 18, 20-year-old men. They didn't have families back home. So they were more than willing to stay out there, find local women, settle down, spend 5 or 10 years guarding the border, then retire and take up a trade. And that's just their life. And this happened millions of times over hundreds of years. And this really expanded the Roman culture across Afro-Eurasia, and allowed the Roman culture to exist in many places thousands and thousands of miles away from Rome proper. Really interesting stuff. Lots of intercontinental trade. All these roads, of course, facilitated trade, but also expanded Roman law, Roman languages, Roman government. You could find evidence of an entire Roman culture's places, thousands of miles away. And they would have the entire law of the government. They'd have Roman construction, Roman architecture, Roman baths, Roman theaters. They would develop their own governmental bodies that would look like the Roman Senate, and their own local provinces. Some very popular trade goods: wheat, wool, pottery, olive oil, of course, any kind of metal. Any type of metal is always a very worthwhile trade good. This is the Iron Age. They're using iron, oil and grain, big things to really trade. Grapes, probably being used for wine, clothes. And the one actually, which I should actually put on here, one of the other largest trade goods was slaves. Slavery was a large trade commodity in this time period because there was so much wars going on, so much interconnected of people, and so many people more advanced than others. More advanced people enslaving less advanced people, common all through human history. So yeah, lots of that going on as well. Lots of trade for slave merchants. Reality, just the way it was. There's some good examples of Roman architecture. You see up here in the top. Let's see if I have. I think I have it in my notes, actually. It doesn't look like I do actually have it. No, I don't. But this is a Roman temple, I believe. This would be a temple to one of the gods. This is an aqueduct, obviously. The water would travel along the top here from the mountains to bring the water down to the cities. These aqueducts still stand all across Afro-Eurasia. You can find these. This one is, I think, one from France. You can still find these incredible projects. These aqueducts, which would be hundreds of miles long, are just crazy, crazy stuff. This is the Coliseum. What's left of the Coliseum. Coliseum was one of the most amazing structures ever built. What you see above ground is only half of it. There was 3 below ground levels. One entire level to house animals, another entire level to house all the gladiators, of which, a lot of them were slaves, another level to hold all the contraption and devices and all the different equipment. The Colosseum was so impressive, they actually sealed it at one time, sealed it completely watertight. That's how well constructed it was. They were able to make it watertight. They filled the entire thing with water and had a naval battle inside with ships. They brought in ships. I mean, imagine the incredible waste of time and resources, because the ships aren't going to fit in through those openings, so they have to tear the ships apart, bring them inside, reassemble them. Imagine how long it took to get how many millions of gallons of water to fill the Colosseum with water, and then they reenacted naval battles. Right in the heart of Rome, right in the heart of the city. And this is a victory arch. Roman emperors often had these built in their honor when they would go off, and Caesar went off and conquered most of Gaul single-handedly with him and his armies and his generals. I don't know which victory arch this is, but you can find a lot of these still standing. And they had these massive arches built, and the stories were on the sides of the arch, built in like this frieze or relief pattern, but actually have the stories of their victories, their conquests, the enemies they conquered, the cities they conquered, all of the treasure and wealth they brought back, all of the ways in which they made Rome greater and more powerful. And they would show all that on these big victory arches. And the emperors, they would have them built where they were gone, because often the emperors will be gone for years. Some emperors will be gone for 20 years. Spend 20 years off conquering, like Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius spent, I think, 18 years conquering the Germania, the Germanic tribes in the 2nd century, 3rd century CE. He spent almost his entire lifetime conquering the Germanic tribes. He spent 20 years away from Rome. So while he's gone and he's having all these victories, he would send people back to Rome, they would build the stuff, and then whenever the emperor came back, he would bring his entire army marching through. You would have this big parade, basically it's a parade, marching through these big victory arches to show how wonderful and how great and how grand he was and how powerful he was. Always a he. We do see a few cases in places like China, India, Egypt. You see rare cases of female emperors. I don't think there was ever a female emperor of Rome. I don't think so. There were women certainly behind the scenes that, pulled the strings of young emperors, because, and then you had like boys that were proclaimed emperor. But was there ever officially a female emperor of Rome? I don't think so. In 500 years, I don't think there ever was one. Roman Republic at its height, Roman Empire at its height, all the green. Again, most of Europe, most of Western Europe. Spain, what we think of as France, all southern Europe, Greece, all the way over to Anatolia, up into, this would be like Russia today, up towards Russia, modern day Russia. All of this is, modern day Turkey, moving into Syria here, Middle East, modern day Israel, Egypt, northern Africa, all the Mediterranean, England, what is modern day England, Britannia. Massive. Massive. As I said at the beginning, an area that today encompasses or touches parts of 50 different countries in the modern world. Largest empire really ever up to this time period. Alexander's empire might be comparable. Depends on how you look at it, and depends on... Literally, Alexander's empire lasted 3 years. 3 years. He dies, and it falls apart immediately. This empire lasted 1,200 years. So even its height, even its biggest size, lasted for well over a century. So far more reaching, and far more long-lasting than what Alexander did. Coming of Christianity. I think this is our last section we'll talk about. I think so. I think that's our last section we'll talk about. And you have to really talk about it because the influence of Christianity on Western culture is, of course, massive. And then Christianity is born in the Roman Empire. The coming of Christianity during this time, during this period of Pax Romana, is this period of when Jesus is born. Jesus is born probably around the year 3. Of course, historically it was the year 0, but as historians have really refined history and looked at it much more closely and looked at historical documents, even though it was sort of established with the Christian church, 0 was supposed to be his birthday. Looks like it was actually around the year 3, actually. We were off a little bit. I've even seen it as far as the year 7. Undoubtedly, Jesus was a real person. Certainly was a real living person. But his life, his 30-so years of life it was a little bit different. He was also born in the summer, by the way. I mean, today we celebrate December 25th as, Christmas, birth of Christ and whatnot, but he was actually born in the middle of the summer. We know that from the Bible itself, from the way the stars are described in the Bible. Historians, astronomers are looked at it and determine, given the time period when he was born, those stars would have only been visible in the way they were described in the summertime in this region of the Middle East. So he was actually born in the summer. The reason for Christmas as a whole has to do with Roman holidays and the Roman winter holidays. He was born in the Roman province of Judea. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. And the religion, which of course is associated with him, Christianity, really doesn't take root until after his death. Not uncommon, though. Not uncommon, really. The major religious expansion of Christianity, Islam, for instance, Buddhism, all those really come after they're dead, after the prophet dies, is really when they become expansive. The life and teaching of Jesus, he was born into a Jewish family, and around age 30, he began preaching. Sometime around age 30, he began preaching to people in the region of Judea, which is generally in the area of what we would think of as Israel today. It's on the west coast of Asia, the Middle East. The Gospels are records of Jesus' life and teachings written between 50 and 150 years after his death. Everything about Jesus was written down long after he died by his followers and his followers' followers. Pretty much nothing was written down during his lifetime. He wasn't overly popular during his lifetime. When he died, he may have had a few thousand followers. He was an outsider. The Jewish population didn't trust him, didn't like him. They felt he was a challenge to the Jewish population. They were associated with his death. They simply saw him as a challenge to their faith. And so most among the Jewish population didn't have any care for him. So the Roman Empire didn't either. The Roman emperors saw his new faith as a challenge to the Roman gods, as a challenge to the Roman religion. So he was an interloper. He was an outsider, and he was disliked by far more than he was liked, simply because of what he represented. A challenge to the status quo, a change, and a new type of religion which was very appealing to the poor, the slaves, the lower classes, who had very few opportunities. Jesus offered them hope of an afterlife, which was not something really offered in any other religion at the time. Not really. An afterlife for common, regular people? Not really a thing that you got in Judaism. You didn't get it in Buddhism. You didn't get it in Egyptian mystery religions. You didn't get it in Roman or Greek religion. This idea of a peaceful afterlife for all common people didn't really exist. Not really. He spoke of obtaining eternal life after death through his devotion to God, love of others. His message was based often on the Jewish traditions. That's real. I mean, he was a Jew, and his teachings are really based on Jewish traditional teachings that he expanded and changed some key practices. He made some key changes, and some of his earliest converts, of course, were Jews, were Jewish people. Also, another thing Jewish fathers and Jewish patriarchs were very, very upset with was this idea of Jesus pulling people away from the Jewish faith. Jesus departed from Jewish teachings. He identified himself as the Messiah. Now, this was something that was actually in Jewish teachings, that there was at some point supposed to be a Messiah of some sort that was supposed to come and bring about the end times, the end of the world, to where the Jewish people were called home, to the chosen people. Well, Jesus portrayed himself as this Messiah, this one who was bringing about the end times. But he wasn't doing it along the Jewish tradition. He was claiming to be the Messiah, which he borrows from Jewish belief, but then he changes it and reforms the entire thing into a new belief that is not really Jewish. He preached this heavenly kingdom for all true believers. He taught around Jewish populations, and yes, there are quite a few Jewish converts, which really gets him on the bad side of Jewish leadership and Jewish authority. He was proclaimed Christ, which meant savior of the population, but not of the Jewish population. That's the thing. Jewish people could convert over to him and join him, but they had to accept these new traditions. So if you were going to maintain a traditional Jewish faith, you were not saved. You were not protected. You were not going to this heavenly bliss, this heaven afterwards. So if you really wanted to be protected and saved, you had to give up Judaism, give up their traditions, and join Jesus, which caused a lot of turmoil with the Jewish population. Of course, the Romans saw him as problematic. He had these large crowds. Hundreds of people would come to see him speak. He claimed this heavenly kingdom, which was contrary to the Roman kingdom. Romans said, heaven was here on earth and among Rome. Heaven was to be a Roman citizen. To be part of the Roman Empire is really the best thing you could ever hope for in all life. Jesus is now saying, what's happening here on earth is really meaningless. Rome is meaningless. The whole heavenly world is meaningless. The only thing that really matters is what happens afterwards. Pontius Pilate was the governor at the time of this province of Judea. He was in charge of maintaining peace in this city of Jerusalem. He condemns Jesus to death by crucifixion. Nothing unusual about this. Again, I don't know the relationship between the cross and the crucifixion. I don't know if those are even related, because the symbol of the cross, I don't know when that came about. That may have come about as a result of the crucifixion. Maybe that's where we get the symbol of the cross from. I don't know the history of it particularly, but the idea of crucifixion was nothing unusual. The Romans had been crucifying people for hundreds of years. There was a big rebellion, a big Jewish rebellion, I forget the year, and the Romans crucified 6,000 Jews, hung them outside the walls of Rome. 6,000 men and women crucified to death, hung outside the walls of Rome, to prove to anyone who challenged Roman authority, because the Jews actually rose up. It was a rebellion. Anyone who challenged Roman authority is what happened to you. So crucifixion was nothing unusual. Crucifixion was normal and standard. It was a standard way of torture and death and putting people on display for crimes. So nothing unusual about that. But he was crucified, as many other people were. According to the faith, according to Jewish mythology, or Christian mythology, the third day afterwards, he rises from the dead. This is the resurrection, which becomes a cornerstone of Christian faith. The idea of dying and being resurrected in the kingdom of heaven. So this becomes the real success of Christianity happened long after his death. Jesus was not really responsible for spreading Christianity. He died. His followers, Paul, for instance, Paul of Tarsus, I think, if that's right. That's not my notes. I think that's right, though. Paul of Tarsus. He was one of his apostles. He was actually Jewish. He was a denouncer, actually. He was someone who actually criticized Jesus as challenging the Jewish faith. And eventually, towards the end of Jesus' life, or at some point in there, Paul converted and believed that Christianity was the way to go. And he then spends the last of his life preaching Christianity till he's eventually caught and imprisoned and I think executed in Rome. But he spent many years doing this. So yeah, the success of Christianity really is a result of the followers and the disciples of Jesus and the disciples of the disciples and the disciples of the disciples, again, many years afterwards. And the Bible isn't written down, what we think of as the Bible, in its earliest form, and it's changed a lot over the years, but in its earliest form wasn't written down till 100 years after his death. This is Jewish catacombs. They had to hide the bodies. Pardon me, I said Jewish, Christian catacombs. The Christians had to actually hide the bodies because they did not want the bodies desecrated or destroyed. They still had a belief, and again, we think Christianity was influenced in many ways by the cult of Isis, which was an Egyptian death cult, believing that when you died, you could be resurrected and brought back into a new life. We think there was a mystery cult. We thought there was a lot of connection between the cult of Isis and Christianity. And one of those connections might have been the Egyptian tradition of keeping the bodies. Romans had a habit of burning bodies. It did happen. It wasn't like it was always that way, but especially of poor and common people, people that didn't have like families, well-known families, they would just burn mass graves and burn the bodies and get rid of them. So the Christians had to make sure the bodies weren't damaged because the bodies had to be preserved. And this might have been associated with the Egyptian belief in the afterlife. And so they entombed all the bodies. They wanted them protected, preserved, because they believed if the Romans got a hold of the Christian bodies, they would burn them, destroy them, mutilate them, whatever they would do. So they did it in there. Well, the catacombs also served as a meeting place. The Christians would meet in private. They would have these secret meetings underground. Because for pretty much most of their history, first 300 years, they were persecuted by the Romans. Persecuted even to the point of execution, mass execution. So they had to hide to survive. And so they would bury the bodies underground, but they would also hide underground. They would have meetings underground, church underground, stuff like this. Yeah, a way of protecting themselves and protecting themselves from observation of the Romans, who often had problem with what Christians did. Spread of Christianity, Paul of Tarsus. Very good, Paul of Tarsus. People continue to meet, continue to expand the faith after Jesus' death. The spread of Christianity happens for several reasons. Paul is one of the biggest. Anytime you see an image of a person that has this circle around their head, that's indicative of a halo. They're a saint. They've been sainted. This is the angelic, the light of God, I guess, behind them. It's the light of heaven around their head, indicating they're a saint. Paul initially persecuted Christians. He was a Roman Jew, but he was converted. He promotes teachings across the empire. He creates communities. Many of Paul's letters are actually in the New Testament. They actually became part of the official scripture of Christianity. So you can read his letters he wrote. He often would write letters to Christian communities, far and wide across the Roman Empire, especially in Europe and Asia. And he established dozens of communities, Christian communities. Singly, this is the one man that's probably the most responsible for keeping Christian faith alive, more so than maybe any individual. Another thing that helps it spread is the empire itself. The empire is this massive place, interconnected, all these people, millions of people, culture, all the roads, ease of transmission of ideas, technology, ease of transmission of religious views, knowledge. This allowed Christianity to spread pretty much unhindered across the Roman Empire. We see it from all the way from Spain, all the way to the Middle East, Northern Africa, making its way all the way up to England and Ireland. All four corners of the Roman Empire, in just a couple hundred years, have the Christian faith. It doesn't mean it's dominant, but it can be seen, evidenced everywhere, simply as a result of the empire itself. The ability for the quick travel and movement of peoples and ideas across this massive empire with the largest population in the world. That is another huge reason Christianity spread and managed to survive, of course. Paul's main targets was the Gentiles, which were non-Jewish populations. That's pretty much everyone but Christians and Jews are these Gentiles. This was his focus of this, which is pretty much the entire Roman Empire. Just about everybody is not Christian or Jew. Jew is a very small population, Christians even smaller. So that was the big focus. He did not spend his time attacking Jewish peoples and going after Jewish people. He did not. We actually find in the very beginning of Jesus, or beginning of when Jesus is teaching, when he's crucified, we see a handful of Jewish people which are really out to get him, because it's obvious he's a threat to their beliefs. But after a short period of time, we actually find Jewish people and Christian people often finding common ground, a common faith, a common basis in faith. So the initial beginnings of of Christianity alongside Judaism was very rocky. But after just a couple generations, we actually find Jewish and Christian communities living together in peace and working together. When from now on, for the next several centuries, Christian converts are mostly focused on pagan Romans. They don't really actively go after Jews. Jesus did, because at the time he was a Jew. His entire community was Jewish. So literally the only people he can convert initially were other Jews. So that was the problem. He took the people that were around him and brought them over to his new faith, and the people who he lived around were mostly Jews. Well, as Christianity expands, there are basically, for every 100 people, there's 99 targets that are not Jewish. So pretty much the Christian faith spends most of its time over the next few centuries focusing on converting over Roman pagans, Roman believers in their Roman gods. Spread across Roman Empire. The empire, Christian teaching spreads across the entire empire. Let's face it. You go into a place where you're poor, you're living in poverty, you're taken advantage of by much more powerful elite people. The empire is always at war. There's always pain and violence and war and conflict, of which the poor people get very little out of it. And suddenly Christians come along and say, hey, this world we live in is fleeting. Life here is miserable, but you know what? It's going to end soon. And you have all eternity in heaven. You are going to be forgiven for all of your sins. You should be helpful and nice to one another. Focus on peace and love and prosperity and the golden rule. There's just so much more to life after life when all this is over. Everything that's happening here, it's so small, who cares? Just muscle through, power through it, and be done with it, and then the next life is going to be much, much better for everybody, the true believers at least. Very, very appealing to an empire full of poor, lower-class, impoverished people living generally miserable lives, subsistence lives. Growing acceptance and evolution of... It's backed up on us. There we go. Growing acceptance and evolution of Christianity. Pagans in the Roman Empire. What's a pagan? That's simply people who believe in, who are simply believers. And Roman belief, the pantheons, Roman gods, the Greek gods, all of that. So that's all that is. They viewed Christianity as a threat. They believed the followers would consider Jesus a rival to Caesar, the Caesar. Not Caesar. Caesar's long dead. But the title of Caesar was a generic term that will often be referred to a title of emperor. They would refer to him as the Caesar, or Caesar as a title. Think of it as the term president. We use the term president. Whoever the president is the president. Caesar was simply the term they would use to refer to the emperor. So they often thought Jesus was a challenge to whoever Caesar was at the time. There's also a big misunderstanding of Christian rituals. Christian rituals talk about eating the body and blood of Christ. whether it's wine or grape juice or bread or little biscuits that we have today. And it was probably the same thing back then. But the idea was that they talked about eating the body and blood of Christ. Some people actually believed that the Christians were drinking blood and eating babies. They did. They believed they were eating babies and drinking blood and doing human sacrifices and actually eating human flesh. Yeah. Now, there were probably rumors and conspiracy theories spread about that kind of stuff, same as we see today. People spreading these things to, attack the Christians. Well, as a result of a lot of these theories, the Christians were attacked. Literally attacked. They were killed. They were persecuted. They were executed. They were tortured. Murdered. They were thrown to wild animals. They were killed in the arenas, killed in the Coliseum, killed by animals, thrown to the lions, tortured until they recanted and gave up their belief in Christianity and stuff like this. Had their tongues cut out. All kinds of crazy stuff. Sometime around the 2nd century, 2nd, 3rd century, we see some more tolerance. After 150 years of Christianity, we do see a little bit of tolerance. The first emperor which really is at all tolerant of Christians is Emperor Trajan. Trajan in the mid 100s, so more than 100 years after Jesus, we see the first emperor which sort of gives it's interesting, it's sort of an analogy to today. They give the don't ask, don't tell story from Trajan. Trajan says, don't ask people if they're Christians, and Christians simply should not admit to being Christian. I don't care if they're Christian, as long as I don't know they're Christian. This was Trajan's. This was actually documented, how Trajan sent this out to the governors and told them this. He wasn't the only emperor that did this. In essence, let the Christians lie, leave them alone. If I don't know they're Christians, I don't care. Doesn't matter to me. Still, persecution was still common, even if we have an occasional emperor which is more lenient on Christians. For the first 300 years, Christianity is still regularly persecuted, attacked, marginalized as well. Eventually, Christians do start to organize. We start to see the establishment of what does become the Catholic Church in the mid 100s, the 2nd century. We start to see the number of converts increasing. We start to see thousands and then tens of thousands of converts in the city of Rome itself. And Rome becomes a center of Christianity. The more and more they persecute them, this is where we talk about the term of martyrs. It seems the more and more Christians were attacked and persecuted, the greater their belief grew. The greater their belief, especially when they demonstrated that they were willing to die for their beliefs. They were willing to willingly walk into an arena with lions, knowing they were going to be ripped to pieces. They willingly went to executions. They willingly walked to crucifixions without having to be chained, or they would give up their lives for God, for Christianity, proclaiming to all those around, look how powerful it is. I'm willing to die. I'm ready to die and be tortured to death, knowing of all the glories and benefits that are going to come after death. It's believed that this willingness of Christians to martyr themselves was a significant factor in the growth of Christianity, or the survival of Christianity, because it moved a lot of people, believing you were willing to go through all of this torture and death for a belief in religious faith. Most Romans were not willing to do that for their belief in their pagan gods. They were not willing to die and sacrifice their lives for their pagan gods, nor did their pagan gods require that or ask that of them. So yeah, we do see organization. Really, we see the establishment of the first real churches. We see a hierarchy of official leadership start to form with the first bishops, the first real leaders of the church. Today, the Catholic Church is a massive hierarchy of different ranks. Back then, really, the only true leadership were the bishops. They were the real church leaders. Every community would have its own bishop. Every church would have its own bishop. And this is really where we see the beginnings of the creation of the Catholic Church itself. Really interesting. The first emperor to legalize Christianity is Emperor Constantine in the year 312. That is when it is officially legalized, 312. And then Theodosius, in the year 380, is the one who makes, and this is the huge, this is the major change, the big one. Theodosius actually makes Christianity the religion of Rome in 380. So 312, it becomes legal. So you can, it's 300 years, almost 300 years after Jesus, you could legally worship now. It isn't like everybody agreed, but you could do it, and Christians were still a minority. And then 380, it becomes the official religion of Rome. And pretty much Christianity is set in that point, as it becomes the the official religion of the massive Roman Empire. Ironically enough, what do Christians start doing once they become leading the Roman Empire? Christians flip it all on their head and they start persecuting pagans. We start seeing pagans being executed and tortured and forced to convert. We see pagan temples being burned down or being gutted and converted into Christian churches. Same exact thing the pagans did to Christians for 3 centuries, the pagans do back. Makes you wonder about that, love your neighbor and do and all the golden rule and be kind, when we see Christians turning it around and throwing Romans to the lions, throwing pagans to the lions because they're unwilling to convert over to Christianity. But we do see the same exact atrocities committed on Roman pagans that had been committed on Christians for years. We see this happening in the 300s and 400s commonly. Very sad state, very sad commentary. But nonetheless, there's a ton of historical evidence that says very clearly it's what happened. Well, I think, there's the bishops. Official in 312, state religion in 380, I already told you that. Yeah, I think that's where we're going to go. I actually had more to talk about once before, but I think I went ahead and cut it out because this was 2 hours is good. 2 hours is good. So that ends this chapter, and thanks for going through it with me, and we will talk to you next week.